Our final speaker, the author of the book Confronting Injustice, is Umair Mohammed. He's a researcher who focuses on the political economy of climate change. He's also a member of the editorial team of Delusions of Development and is studying for his PhD at York University. Umair.
I haven't even said anything. You might be booing by the end. Hopefully not. Okay, so I'm going to start by explaining why I wrote the book, and then by giving a picture of the main themes that are in it for the people who haven't read it, and then I'll along the way and at the end I'll try and respond to some of what the other speakers have said. So I started writing the book a few years ago as a way to engage with the ideas and arguments that I often heard within the activist circles I was a part of. And a lot of my activist friends would refer to historical figures like Gandhi and Malcolm X and others when they were talking about their own political beliefs. And I was a young kid at the time. I'm still a young kid, I think. I hope. But at the time, at least, I was very young and I didn't know anything. I certainly didn't know anything about Gandhi or Malcolm X. So I went and I read some of the things that they'd written. And the more I read, the more I realized that when we often associate these sorts of people with the kinds of politics that we carry on today, we're not really being very accurate. And so I tried to get others interested in reading, but that didn't really go very far. So eventually I thought, okay, I'll write a book, and then my activist friends will have to read that, right? Because they'll be like, well, Umair wrote a book, maybe we should read it. So it's a weird thing to want to write a book, and maybe that's a weird reason to do it, but that was the initial spark for it. So in the book I point out, and some people have touched on this, but I point out that there's a pervasive lack of appreciation for the structural roots of social problems like global inequality and environmental destruction. So when activists try to explain the reasons why something like climate change is taking place, they'll say it's because people have decided that they want to drive cars and that they want to eat lots of meat. And of course the solution then to climate change is to get people to stop driving cars, to ride their bikes instead, and to become vegetarians. Even among people who are willing to come to terms with the fact that there are societal imperatives that produce things like climate change, that it's not just a matter of people deciding that they want to drive cars and eat burgers. Even when people acknowledge this, there is still a willingness to support the idea that individual lifestyle changes and conscious consumerism could be a way to start addressing climate change. So people will say, yes, environmental destruction has its basis, in the structures of our social system, but individuals making changes in the way they live, in what they buy, that's part of the solution. Or they'll say everyone has to do their part, everyone has to do their little bit. So, I'd approach people as a young activist who claimed they were doing political organizing, and the first thing they'd want you to do is learn how to make kale sandwiches. And to me that sounds kind of gross. I don't really want to eat kale sandwiches. And people would say, well, you have to be the change, like Gandhi says. So by the time I'd gotten around to reading a fair bit of Gandhi, it became clear to me.
He never said that.
Well, it became clear to me that certainly his politics could not be boiled down to promoting lifestyle changes. And I looked into it a bit, and it turns out that Gandhi actually never said, be the change you want to see in the world. There is no documentary evidence to suggest that he ever uttered or wrote those words. And Gandhi was one of the most prolific writers in human history. He wrote a lot of things down. Be the change was not one of them. In fact, Gandhi actually seems to suggest the opposite in a couple of places. In his autobiography, as well as in his translation of John Ruskin's Unto This Last, which he translated into Gujarati, which was then translated again into English, Gandhi says, quote, "The good of the individual is contained in the good of all." So that is to say, if we want to change, or if we want to help the individual, we have to change society. And certainly in his own, politics, he had a weird cult-like lifestyle, and I'm not, saying people go into that, but and often he wouldn't even suggest that people do that. He was just sort of going around trying things out on his own. But as for a politics, and I understand, the left critique of Gandhi, and there were lots of weird things about him. I would suggest that, and especially among South Asians, so I can see why Sadia hates Gandhi. A lot of South Asian leftists don't like him because, of course, the success that Gandhi had and the success that the Indian National Congress had meant that the left in British India was marginalized, and lots of religious politics and other things came in. They came to the fore, and we had lots of problems, and we continue to have lots of problems. But I think even within that context, we need to realize that there was something about that kind of politics that allowed it to succeed where the left failed, and certainly we can try and learn from it, even though we may not want to mimic it at all times. In any case, to return to the book, I make a case similar to I think what Gandhi stood for, at least more broadly speaking, that you have to change society to help individuals. And I argue that the social context we live in constrains and directs our actions as individuals. So it's the social context, therefore, that we have to seek to transform, even if what we're interested in ultimately is reorienting the behavior of individuals. So we don't start by telling people, hey, change the way you're behaving. You start by trying to change the social context, and it can lead to a change in people's behavior. And when people hear this kind of argument, they often respond by saying, well, conscious consumerism, individual lifestyle changes, these things are a good first step, right? This is a good first step. And a lot of us, a lot of people on the left as well, buy into this idea that these things are a good first step. And Sadia touched on this a bit, but I want to reiterate it here. I want to suggest that this is not at all the case. Certainly what I've seen in my time as an activist is that those who take up lifestyle-centric activism don't often take another step. They end up remaining stuck in place and just trying to convince more and more people to adopt changes in their lifestyles, and then to find endlessly greater ways to make their own carbon footprint and whatever else smaller. And I want to suggest that there is a qualitative difference between embracing the individualism inherent in lifestyle approaches to activism. So on the one hand, that, and a qualitative difference between that and coming to recognize the social dimensions of the problems we face. That individual forms of activism are not a bridge to social forms of activism, that they're a distraction. They're a step in the wrong direction. And if anything, the first step we need to take in engaging with social activism should be to openly reject individualist approaches. So that's sort of the main crux of the argument as far as the main theme in the book. And I developed the theme by using certain topics as case studies, including global poverty and climate change, as well as privilege-based identity, anti-oppression politics, whatever you want to call it. So I've touched a little bit on the discussion about the environment, and I'd like to briefly discuss some of the other things, including poverty and anti-oppression. So one of the main figures in the global anti-poverty movement, people may know this person, he is the Australian moral philosopher Peter Singer. Singer has a famous parable that he uses to advocate a certain kind of approach to addressing poverty. He says, imagine you're walking to work one day and there's a pond, by the sidewalk that you're walking across, and you find this day that there's a child drowning in this pond. Now, if this situation arises, it would be incumbent upon you to wade into the pool and to save this child. If you said, well, I don't really want to ruin my shoes and be late for work, then you're clearly an immoral person. So Singer uses this example and says, well, this is sort of the situation that we confront when we're talking about global poverty. If, as individuals who are able to help people in dire need, if we don't do so, we are just like this person who's walking across, walking to work and doesn't save this child's life. And so he suggests that individuals adopt an austere lifestyle and give regularly to charity. I want to suggest that Singer is wrong. I want to say don't give to charity. That sounds bad. That's not necessarily what you need to take away from this. But I want to suggest that modern day poverty can't be explained with reference to a random child drowning in a random pond somewhere. There is not much about global poverty today that's random. A child in the pond didn't fall in by accident. It was pushed in. And that's what we need to try to address. Who keeps pushing these kids into ponds, and what can we do to stop them? When we frame the problem in this way, we can come to understand that individualistic, charity-based solutions to global poverty aren't the right way. We have to approach the problem from a social and political standpoint. So moving on to the identity stuff that Sadia brought up. Let me talk a little bit about it, and perhaps I'll be a bit provocative here because it is presented provocatively in the book. So maybe I'll do that. Yeah. So this approach to activism has, I'm sure everyone knows, acquired a broad appeal. I argue that the outlook and concepts that anti-oppression promotes tend to be individualistic, confused, and unhelpful. One of the leading proponents of this kind of politics is the black feminist writer Bell Hooks. So I hadn't read Bell Hooks until a short while ago, and I had a bunch of friends who were like, "Oh, Mary, you really love Bell Hooks." So I read her, and what you find is that she repeatedly uses phrases like imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy, just nonstop. And at first, it's like, oh, this is really radical. And then, by the time you get to the third page, it's like, okay, I don't really know what any of this means. She's just using these terms for not a very, meaningful reason. And what you find is that in reading someone like Hooks, what's happened is that moral outrage has taken the place of commentary and analysis. So people like Hooks have helped to create a political culture in which the use of radical sounding language has come to replace the practice of radical politics. Now, you don't have to know what anything means as long as you know which words to use. Repetition of specific buzzwords passes for substantive discussion. And whereas the terms being repeatedly deployed, whether it's capitalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, decolonization, and so on, these terms, I think, at one time had political significance. They now seem to only find meaning in the individualized and interpersonal sense. And so, of course, the most important part of anti-oppression politics are its pronouncements on on such things as gender and race issues, and we're told that the solution to sexism and racism is to acknowledge on every possible occasion your gender and racial privilege, and to make sure that your personal interactions with women and people of color aren't tainted by prejudice. What any of this has to do with ending racism and with ending sexism is beyond me. I can acknowledge my privilege all day long. It's not going to do anything. And one of the things I found in anti-racist organizing is that people will, in one breath, sort of praise Malcolm X, or they'll talk about Huey Newton, and the Panthers, and in the next breath they'll say, well, I'm going to go make white people feel bad about the privilege they have. And I have for a long time been made uncomfortable by this sort of thing, because as I started reading people like Malcolm X, it became clear to me that they didn't stand for this kind of thing, that they stood for something much different, and for a universal human emancipation. Certainly they were concerned about racism, as I think we all are.
The microphone turned off. Maybe use this one.
Okay. How long have I been talking and no one's been here?
I think all of them are. Can you speak up maybe?
Hello?
Yeah, I think they're all.
Okay.
This is the degrowth.
I see. This is what degrowth does, yes. How much time do I have, by the way?
A minute or so.
Oh, can I keep going? Sorry. Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
I mean, obviously keep.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so right, I think that the civil rights movement, certainly it has lots of huge amounts of significance in North America. I don't think that that it can be used as as something that's supportive of the kind of anti-racist politics that we practice today. I think that it's very different, and certainly in the book, I think in the last chapter where I deal with MLK, I draw that out. I don't bring Malcolm X so much into it, but anyway, you'll have to see. In any case, I would suggest that the problems of racism and sexism don't have their roots in individual acts of discrimination. They can certainly manifest themselves in the form of discrimination, but these problems have social roots. And acknowledging one's privilege and not being an ass to women is just being a decent person, I think. I don't think it's the same thing as trying to create social change. And so of course one should try to be a decent person, I think, but ultimately we live in a sexist society, and so we would, I think, probably a lot of the time fail. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try to be decent people. I just think that we should see the difference between that and activism. I think they're different planes. And ultimately, I think we have to deal with the social roots of racism and sexism if we hope to address these problems. And just to touch on a few other things quickly, because I know I'm running over here, on the issue of shrinking the size of the economy. So, yeah, sorry, I know there's lots of things that are being discussed. I'm throwing lots of things around. The book is weird because it's pretty small, but it's about a lot of things. So this is one of the problems with it. You have to sort of tie lots of things together. But I hope I do that okay. In any case, as for degrowth, which is something that Stefan raised, so in the original edition of the book, so for people who don't know, this book, I tried to self-publish it a couple years ago, and I didn't really know what I was doing, so eventually I went to a publisher and they did it right. And so now this is the real version. But in the original edition, the word degrowth was actually used. And in this edition, I took it out. And this is because I started reading some of the degrowth literature, And I didn't really want the book to be associated so closely with that movement. I mean, certainly I agree. I think that to deal with environmental destruction and climate change, I think you have to have, you have to shrink the size of the economy. But I think that a lot of what the degrowth movement does is engage in this kind of moralizing that I critique in the book, and they encourage this term that I keep hearing now, nowtopias. We should build nowtopias. And my friend Connor is laughing because I bother him about this. It's that we should just create a local commune and grow our own vegetables and it'll be all great. I mean, I think this is not really a good way to go. So I mean, I hope we can talk more about that. As for just intellectuals and academics, or what are we, intellectuals, academics, or activists, or whatever? I don't know. I've always thought of myself as an activist. I went to grad school so that I could learn to be a better activist or a better organizer. And now, whenever I'm organizing, I'm sort of the intellectual or whatever. But I don't know. I think this is it's a weird sort of distinction we make. I think as activists, we don't take seriously the task of engaging in intellectual work. That there's this kind of division of labor. It's like, oh, the academics do that and we do the action. And it's like, well, if you just engage in action, I don't know. I don't know how far that gets us. We have to do the thinking as well. So that's what I'll say about that. Finally, I guess what I'll say. Actually, two more things. So political parties. I don't know if I meant to suggest that political parties have to be the primary vehicle for change. Perhaps, I don't know. I don't know the answers. But I think we do have to engage in a struggle to capture power. And I think for that we have to use things like political parties. And I think, but it also means that as a left, we have to reimagine what a political party is, and that it's not just a tool for seeking electoral victories. And that in fact, some of the things that Sadia raised about creating different kinds of social infrastructure, whether it's serve the people programs or creating community councils or workers' councils, I think a party can serve as a basis to build that kind of infrastructure, and certainly so that different localized efforts can be connected together. And I think that we're very afraid of hierarchy today, and I don't know why that. I think you can have a democratic framework in which hierarchy exists, obviously, and that you can still keep things okay. So anyway, so that's my last point. The book is an invitation to continuing dialogue, and certainly with myself, because when I first sat down to write it, I was learning a lot. I'm still and I've continued to learn a lot. And I mean, some of the things had I sat down to write it today, there would have been several things in the book that would have been different. But I do think it would have been as provocative as it is in certain places. And this is because I think there's so much unwillingness to have dialogue. One of the main problems I see with the kind of identity politics and this anti-oppression politics that's so popular is that it shuts down dialogue, so that we can't have conversation. And so therefore I maybe that's why I felt the need to respond in a little bit of a provocative way. Anyway, I'll end it here. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.